Well, good afternoon. I'm here with Dr. Steve Davies, the Educational Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you for joining us today, Steve.
Thank you.
We're talking today about the national debt. There are many on the left who argue that the national debt isn't really a problem, that Britain has had national debt significantly larger during its history. Is the national debt a problem?
The national debt itself is not a problem. People who make that argument are quite correct. In the whole of the history since the national debt was invented in the 1690s, there have been many occasions when it's been significantly higher as a share of GDP than it is now. It was higher than it is now, for example, throughout most of the 18th century, and it peaked at 248% of GDP in 1818. It then declined to about 25% by the end of the 19th century, and it also peaked again at about 250% of GDP immediately after World War II in the 20th century, before declining to a low point again of 25% at the end of the 1960s. So it has been much higher. The crucial problem is not so much the debt, it's the deficit. In other words, it's the rate at which we are adding to the debt every year. More than half of the current debt has been run up in the last 3 years, for example. If we continue to add to the accumulated debt at the current rate, then within less than 15 years, we will have actually got back to the level of debt that we had at the end of World War II. And the critical point to realise is that this kind of deficit is simply unprecedented in peacetime. Governments have run up debts like this before during wartime, but this is the first time ever that there's been such a rapid accumulation of debt on an annual basis during a time when no major war has been fought.
In previous times that the UK government has run up these debts, how have they managed to pay them off?
Well, by three main things. One is that in the aftermath of major conflicts, which is what we're talking about here, governments of all parties have typically run a fairly tight ship. They've run a responsible fiscal policy, they haven't run large deficits. They've even run surpluses frequently, which obviously has enabled them to retire a large part of the debt. Secondly, they've simply not borrowed as much as they've been paying back, so they've reduced it that way. And finally, and in some ways most importantly, they've been able to reduce the value of the debt because of economic growth. Because if you measure debt essentially as a proportion of GDP, then obviously to the extent that GDP grows, the size of the debt as a share of that denominator is going to go down. The problem at the moment is that the levels of debt that we have in the British economy right now, both public and private, will represent a continuing drag upon prospects for economic growth, and so that escape is much more difficult than it has been in the past.
Well, in that case, aren't some of those, like Ed Balls, correct when they say that what we need to do is stimulate the economy to create growth, because that's how you pay off the debt?
Well, they are certainly correct about that. We certainly do need a growth strategy. The problem is that the strategy they advocate for, at least in the short term stimulating growth, is high levels of government spending, a fiscal stimulus in other words. There is no evidence that this would actually do the job. The paper published by Christina Romer when she was President Obama's chief economic advisor indicated that the so-called multiplier effect of fiscal stimulus today is only 1.5, which quite frankly is feeble. And all the evidence suggests that that would only be very short-lived, and in fact it would then become negative. It would actually make the economy grow more slowly than it otherwise would have done. So although we definitely need a growth strategy, a fiscal stimulus, sustained high levels of government spending and borrowing are not the way to deal with a debt deleveraging recession such as what we have now.
So what should the government do?
The government needs to do two things, well, three things. First of all, it does need to get the public finances under control, because we simply can't go on adding to the burden of the debt at the rate at which we are currently doing. Secondly, they need to introduce supply-side reforms which will increase productivity and therefore make the economy grow more rapidly in the medium to longer term. This, however, doesn't have quick results. Typically, reforms of this kind take about 7 to 10 years to actually come through and have an effect. The third thing they need to do is to alleviate the burden of debt on the British public, and what that probably involves is writing off a large amount of existing debt as bad. The problem is that that will almost certainly require that several financial institutions are either recapitalised or else are wound up in an orderly fashion, because one of the big problems is that we realistically still have a very large amount of malinvestment and bad debt in the British economy, particularly but not exclusively in the housing sector.